If you want better quality 3D prints, you should probably dry your filament. That's it. End of video. Hello everyone, Chris here. If you've been 3D printing for any amount of time at all, you've probably already been told repeatedly that you should dry your filament. And I'm not one to go over the same thing again and again, trying to bring a point home. But when I see very obvious evidence of filament that might have just a little bit of moisture in it that we could correct, I feel obligated to share it all with you. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to share my experience with drying filament. We are going to be focused on PETG today because it can be impacted by moisture pretty quickly. But I've never really seen a filament that couldn't benefit from a bit of drying. All the way from PLA, up into nylon and PEEK and Ultem that are very hygroscopic, but PETG is a nice mix in the middle of the road filament that definitely can benefit from a little bit of drying. So let's just jump right into it. I'll show you what to look for and what I saw recently when I noticed that I needed to dry this spool of filament. So let's just start here with the artifacts you might see on your printed part if your filament could use some drying. This is Filament PETG Galaxy Black. We're currently in the middle of a live stream series where we're building a Prusa Bear, and I've been printing most of the parts out of this Galaxy Black filament. It has been hanging from one of the rafters in the basement for quite a while. I usually don't have any problems with PETG out in open air, but there are a few conditions where I have seen that, and we'll go over it. But you'll notice on this part, there's lots of stringing. And these are mostly caused when you have a large retraction and you're moving all the way across the part. It leaves these strings. But you can see a lot of blobs as well. Those strings can bunch up, turn into blobs on the part, and you might even see them inside the extrusion. You can see over in this corner, it's very obvious that that filament has built up and it's deposited on the print. Right in here is a great example. If the filament has too much moisture in it while it's trying to lay it down, it could even introduce some gaps and make the part a bit weak. And that's definitely something that we don't want any part of. From the outside of the part, it really doesn't look all of that bad. Just cosmetically, it could use some help. And this being just an LCD cover, we're really not worried about anything structural. But when I see something like this, it's a great indication that my filament spool might need just a bit more help. Again, today we're focused on PETG. It can be impacted by moisture significantly, and it will pick it up out of the air relatively easily. But I've also seen PLA that was a bit stringy. I dried it for a couple of hours and it returned back to normal. That's where you need to be focused on what that filament might be mixed with. It's very common to mix PLA with TPU. TPU is greatly impacted by moisture where PLA might not be. So consider who made it and how it was manufactured before you decide to dry that filament. But again, PETG, this one definitely needed a little bit of dry time. So let's just talk about real quick how I dry this here in the basement. This is my old school PrintDry setup. I got this a long time ago. It has dried hundreds of spools of filament over the years. Now, it is getting pretty long in the tooth. I have a different version of the PrintDry system, but I still use this one all the time. It will range from pretty low temp, all the way down to 30°C, up to 70°C, and it's fairly accurate. But it's pretty much just a glorified food dehydrator. It's the same type of unit, it does the same thing, it has the same controls as a food dehydrator. They're just providing this housing so you didn't have to go through and cut up all those trays that you might see in your average dehydrator. This style will do 2 spools pretty effectively. It'll dry them fairly quickly within a couple of hours, and you can also use the spool directly from here if you need to. It has some bearings for both levels where the spool will spin and push it out these holes in this housing. The dehydrator method works out pretty well for drying most filaments. It's easy to use, it's compact, and it's fairly cost efficient. Now, you don't have to get one that's designed for 3D printer filament. Any one that you can find to hack your way to fitting one of these spools should work out. Hopefully it can make it up to around 70°C. That'll get most of the filament done until you get up into the higher levels of filament, like PEEK and Ultem. they will need a much higher temperature. But the next question is, why is there moisture in my filament and how I can prevent it in the first place? And I've found the biggest impact of filament is humidity in the room. And that might seem simplistic, maybe like everyone should know that, but it's hard to gauge how humid the room might be at all times, and I've struggled with this over the years. The biggest time that I see filament impact is during the mild months, when the HVAC doesn't run at all. We don't need heat or cooling. That's when the humidity can get high and start impacting the filament. And you really need a way to monitor that, or to at least keep track of it so you can keep it from happening. And a humidity sensor like this one that I can track with my phone has really helped me out. Now I can realize what the humidity and temperature levels are all day and all night, rather than just the times that I'm down here in the basement. I've noticed during a couple of months of the year, usually around March and then into September, the temperature can fluctuate. I can track that and just see when the humidity might be getting a little bit too high and start impacting all of my materials. You can see from the app for this particular sensor, this is from Inkbird. This is pretty straightforward to use and pretty low cost. But during the mid-month, we got actually pretty warm here in the middle of the country, and the HVAC didn't run at all. So you can see around the 7th, 8th, and 9th, humidity started to spike up to almost 50%. Then after the 14th, we took a cold snap. The humidity was down because the furnace was running quite a bit. But this was really the only way that I could keep an eye on the humidity level effectively. I do have a lot of different temperature sensors around the basement helping me to monitor humidity and do all that kind of good stuff, but that requires me to actually take a look at them and try to track what the changes might be. This has made things much easier. And I'm not trying to insinuate at all that you need to do all of this and track every facet of the room to get good 3D prints, but I am trying to make it obvious that it can be very hard to predict your environment. You might think it's a lot more consistent than it is, and we all know Mother Nature will have the last word. So in my case, tracking it like this made it much easier to see why the filament condition might be changing from time to time. So with that, we might need to dry some filament every now and then. So on to the drying. So basically here I've just put my spool in my dehydrator, I've kicked it on, I set it to about 65°C for PETG. But I'm just trying to show you how much time it would take to dry a spool of filament like this. Different filaments are going to vary, but this one's set to Fahrenheit. I can get to around 145 Fahrenheit. So around 65°C, give or take. But this will show you just how quickly the humidity comes down, and then we'll compare it to the outside environment as it starts to go up. So you can see about an hour and a half in, we're starting to dry the filament. Humidity inside the dehydrator is already down to 10%. We're running at 130 Fahrenheit. And outside, the actual temperature is around 65 Fahrenheit. That temperature is being impacted by the heat from the unit and as well as the humidity. But just to give you an idea of the difference inside and out. And that's the next thing that I want to touch on. You need to be careful where you're using your dehydrator at. So the next thing you need to consider is where you're actually doing that filament drying at. Think about it. We're trying to get microscopic amounts of moisture out of our filament so that it prints better. You probably don't want to do that process where you're storing or using your filament, because that moisture has to go somewhere. Now, if you're not doing a lot of filament, you can probably get away with this and have that moisture dissipate before it impacts anything else, but it's definitely something to consider. You might need to do this to a lot of filament. I've seen these dryers that'll hold 6 and 8 spools. That can become a concern based on how much moisture might be involved or how much filament and where you're located. If it can't get rid of all that moisture, it's going to go someplace and it might be back to that filament that you were just trying to dry. But let's go back to the dryer in progress and just check and see where we're going to end up. So after around 5 hours of drying the filament, I suggest for PETG, if you're running at about 65°C, drying it for 5 to 6 hours, that should be pretty good for any spool. But I wanted to let it set here a moment just to see what the temperatures did as they equalized, to see what the outside versus the inside temperature of the dehydrator might end up. Again, the room temperature was actually around 65 Fahrenheit, about 40% humidity. That top thermometer has been impacted by being on top of the dehydrator. I was just trying to show the contrast. Again, just out of curiosity, an hour later, we were up to 19% inside the dehydrator, down to 77 Fahrenheit, and roughly the same on top. We did cool down a bit, but they've pretty much stabilized even an hour after the dehydrator had been turned off. I was just interested in what the stats would be. So we dried our spool at 65°C for about 6 hours in total. We should be ready to go ahead and try another print. Now, I'm not printing this on anything special. The first print was done on my Prusa Mark 2.5 that I had for many years, and the second print was done exactly the same way on the same printer. And to prove it, I thought we'd go ahead and take a look at a time lapse. And here's the results just after 6 hours in the dryer. You can see the stringing is no longer there at all. It's pretty much non-existent. Again, the same spool of filament, it's just been dried a bit. All of the blobbing that you saw before in the corners has disappeared. The part overall is just a lot higher quality. Even some of the characteristics on the front are just a little bit sharper. And just so you can see this side by side, you can see just how stringy and how many blobs you can see on that top part that hasn't been dried versus the one that has. Depending on the part and the filament you use, I would call this night and day difference. And this is just stuff that you can see. Take that into account. What does the quality of the filament look like inside the walls? If you had a part that you were relying on it being very strong, relying on its integrity, you definitely want to go ahead and dry your filament. Filament drying for the win. We were able to improve the quality of this 3D printed part by drying this specific spool of PETG. But remember, not every filament is going to be the same regarding what temperature you want to dry it at, the duration, or if you need to dry it at all. There will be some experimentation involved here. I'm trying to just give you some insight to what I would look for on a particular part when I start looking at drying my filament, or at least looking at the room conditions that currently exist. I also try to give you a roundabout look at the parameters that my room stays at and the conditions that I go through when I might start looking at taking a little better care of my filament, like storing it in a dry box, or just starting from scratch, putting it in the dryer for a while, and starting again to see if that clears up some of my issues. Now remember, at the top of this video I said, this topic has been covered a lot, but hopefully I included a few tips here that you hadn't considered before, and this will help on your future 3D prints. So hopefully this is helpful. That's it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.